Our next speaker, Matthew Kraushar, earned his Bachelor's in Neuroscience at Columbia University and is an MD-PhD student here in Rutgers Robert Wood Johnson Medical School, Princeton University Joint Program. Having completed his first 2 preclinical years in 2012, Matthew is currently in his 3rd year of his PhD program, with his research focusing on fetal brain development. I first had the pleasure of meeting Matt as a teaching assistant of one of our small group sessions, the infamous jigsaws that the M1s and M2s know all about. As first-year medical students, we were very overzealous and very anxious. But Matt, through his cool composure and his wealth of technical knowledge, helped us get through it, no sweat. It is thus no surprise that he's going to be presenting this evening, because from everyone I've spoken to, we are all in awe of how great he is. It is my sincere pleasure to introduce Matthew to speak with you this evening.
So you stop to take a look around, and it's hard to believe this is real. Dozens are waiting in line for food and water on the street, shivering. Many are elderly, and the wind blowing off the coast makes the freezing weather even worse. Chunks of buildings are scattered on the ground, trees pin down power lines. It's very quiet, and it's very dark. Not a single window has a glow behind it, and the hum of the neighborhood has gone silent. The landscape feels dangerous and unfamiliar to everyone who lives here. This is not a disaster in some faraway place, somewhere you read about and maybe forget. This happened in the place I call home. On the night of October 29th, 2012, Hurricane Sandy made landfall on the northeast coast of the United States. It would become one of the most devastating natural disasters to life and property in U.S. history. Many coastal communities, engulfed by the surging floodwaters, would never recover. But my neighborhood decided its story was going to be different. Today, I want to talk about how community becomes medicine during a crisis, and how we, as a community of healthcare professionals at all different levels of training and type of specialty, can be a part of that. Maybe when the next crisis comes, we'll be ready. I live in a coastal neighborhood in South Brooklyn called Red Hook. It's home to about 11,000 people, including the largest public housing development in Brooklyn. Floodwaters poured in through second-story windows in some areas, cars found flipped over, people's lives and livelihoods washed away. The only local clinic and pharmacy destroyed. This is a picture taken by my neighbor down the block. There was a massive utilities outage, including electricity, heat, hot water, sanitation, and critically, mobile and landline telephone and internet communication. I didn't know it at the time, but I'd be cooking with a headlamp and sleeping in my sleeping bag to stay warm for weeks. So we were isolated by the storm, but to our surprise, we felt alone. I think many believe, especially in a post-9/11 resource-rich city like New York, that Captain America will just swoop in after a disaster, that some agency or acronym will take responsibility in a crisis. But like Hurricane Katrina before, the lack of disaster management was glaring. So Red Hook, in its spirit of gritty determination, took action. The effort started simply, just making sandwiches, bailing out basements, but within 48 hours, this local effort would become incredibly organized and large scale, as people realized that if help was going to come, it would have to come from within the community. The main groups organizing the effort were a local community center called the Red Hook Initiative, activist groups like Occupy Sandy, and many local residents and business owners. Overnight, church basements transformed into food distribution hubs, serving 3 hot meals a day coordinated by a local chef. A single mom down the street from me became a disaster coordinator, and the community center became Disaster Management Central, fielding volunteers from across the country to distribute donated supplies. And somewhere in the midst of this buzz of activity, on the third day post-storm, I was asked to coordinate a medical relief effort. Now, at the time, I'd only recently transitioned to the PhD phase in the combined MD-PhD program here at Rutgers Robert Wood Princeton. Beyond a little bit of EMS and some wilderness first aid in my background, with only 2 years of med school, I'm basically just the guy that lives down the street. I had been waiting in a friend's basement wearing grimy coveralls that smelled like the East River when I was approached by one of the leaders in the recovery effort. He explained to me that many volunteers were encountering individuals in the community who were in states of deteriorating health. Many agencies had been contacted directly, but it was clear that unless these people could make it to a hospital or to a healthcare center, no organization was going to monitor their health in the wake of the storm. So my first thought was to consider what had happened after Hurricane Katrina. I remember reading about how many chronically ill individuals who were normally stable became acute emergencies in these highly stressful conditions. I thought about the 80-year-old on the top floor of the public housing high-rises on supplemental oxygen, but with no working elevator. Or what about the diabetic who was running out of insulin and eating irregularly? Or those with mobility and disability issues? How would they access help if they couldn't even call 911 because the phones were down? See, these people were in the blind spot of our healthcare system, without a mechanism to help them when they were effectively isolated. So our goal became to put out the fire before it started, to find these people before their trip to the emergency department, or maybe before they were found dead in their homes. So our first problem was actually a data problem. We didn't know who these people were, where they were, what was their current condition, or could they access help if they needed it. To solve this, we created a very basic one-page medical intake form. The neighborhood was mapped into sub-regions, and over 100 volunteers canvassed the entire community with this form, door to door, focusing particularly on the public housing, which was screened twice. Volunteers would complete the orange part of the form to record individuals who requested help for their health conditions. This was completed in about a day and a half and created a basic census of the medically fragile in our community. Simultaneously, via word of mouth and social media, we began to form a smaller team of medically trained volunteers. Doctors, nurses, PAs, EMS, and medical students walked into our makeshift dispatch center, which we set up in a back room of the community center. Now, obviously, we didn't focus too much on photography during this whole thing, but this is where we set up shop, and you can see it was done on the fly. Healthcare workers hailing from across New York, the US, and even Europe showed up, and we began to form a rotating staff. So the return intake forms were triaged, and small teams of these healthcare workers began to make home visits, filling out the blue part of the intake form with their notes from these visits. A fully licensed physician was always present in the dispatch center to monitor and support each team and mobilize when necessary. But really, all of our work was done in the field, building by building, apartment by apartment, with many long, dark stairwells in between, as most of our work was done in the high-rises. And only the most basic preventative medicine was performed, and always within the training of healthcare workers. Monitoring signs and symptoms for escalating disease states, recording glucose measurements, taking blood pressures, these were common. But over time, conditions encountered were severe. One day I was walking between visits when I was stopped on the street by a young man. He told me his father had some heart problems and really wasn't looking very good. So I rushed over. I remember climbing the A stairwell because the B stairwell in the high-rises was being used as a toilet since sanitation wasn't functioning in these buildings. I opened up his door and a wall of steam flooded into the hallway. And I looked inside his apartment, Water was dripping from the ceiling. It was hazy. Everything was saturated. There was an old man sitting next to a stove and a boiling pot of water, wearing a soaked winter jacket. See, this man with congestive heart failure had been boiling water for over a week straight to stay warm because gas was the only working utility in his building. So I approached and I said, run into your son on the street. Would you like some help? And he weakly nodded. And during the course of the visit, just from the small effort of taking his arm out of his soaked jacket, this man was thrown into acute chest pain, shortness of breath, and diaphoresis. A runner was sent to call 911, and he would survive his heart attack. But we just happened to be there. The next several weeks were exhausting. And even after 12, 14-hour days, it kept me up every night. The weight of responsibility that I felt towards these people was crushing. It was a kind of responsibility I had never experienced before. And the human suffering wasn't just depressing, it made me angry, because it did not have to be this way. I knew our shoestring operation was not the level of care these people deserved. It was just the only option that they had. There were many dark moments, and I had never cried so much in my adult life. But I think what sustained all of us was the spirit of community. It was late one night in the dispatch center, and I was going through some of the intake forms from the day's work. It was a quiet moment. And a woman walked in, an asthmatic that we had seen earlier in the week, and we'd gotten her a refill of her medications and a battery-powered nebulizer. She looked a lot better. She was carrying a brown paper bag, which she handed to me, and inside were bronchodilator refills in it. And I said, why are you giving this to me? What is this for? And she said, I know a lot of asthmatics are struggling in the community right now, and at the moment, I have enough. And I told her, you don't have to do this. And she looked right at me and she said, it's the right thing to do, and just turned around and walked out. Now I know this woman, and I know she didn't have much, and she really struggled after the storm. And yet she managed to do something extraordinary, something that no agency or organization did, but could have done. So after about 3 weeks, we had seen over 300 individuals. Most received 2 or more visits by healthcare workers, some receiving as many as 10. The main conditions destabilizing over time were asthma, COPD and emphysema, insulin-dependent diabetes, and hypertension. 8 highly unstable individuals were connected to the 911 system. And while 97 deaths occurred in other storm-affected communities, to the best available knowledge, there were no storm-related deaths in Red Hook. So we learned some valuable lessons from our experience. We learned what not to expect in a crisis. And in many ways, ad hoc altruism is not an optimal large-scale disaster medical response. But the solution might be pretty simple and pretty cheap. A community-based system might fill a gap that continues to exist in disaster medicine. This does not replace emergency services or provide advanced medical care, but it serves as a bridge between these pre-existing resources and the isolated medically fragile in our communities. Right now in Red Hook, we're developing a resiliency plan to activate in the next crisis to help our community's most vulnerable members. Importantly, this has to involve all of us. We're not just a community of healthcare professionals. We're not just a part of the communities that we live in and that we care about. We're part of a larger community of healthcare professionals that are in a unique position to help. And I really mean all of us, at all different levels of training and type of specialty, can and have to be a part of this for it to work. Communities are the strongest when they stand united. What happened in Red Hook was in every way a team effort. And I was just a small piece of that. And I'm here today, in part, to thank the dozens of healthcare workers and hundreds of other selfless volunteers. Our neighborhood is deeply, deeply grateful. So if you can walk to someone's house, take a basic history, take a blood pressure, you can be a part of this. I think particularly as medical students, we often feel small and powerless, overshadowed by the flashy techniques and the expensive equipment and the incredible physicians who have tremendous skill, who are our mentors. But maybe the most basic preventative medicine can have a huge impact. You know, I think during extreme events, headlines and attention often turn towards feats of momentary heroism and dramatic rescues. But maybe the greatest impact is achieved by simply knocking on every door. Thank you.